and welcome back to another episode of the VC Corner. Those of you joining us again, welcome back. Those of you joining us for the first time, the VC Corner is a series of episodes designed to delve into the often unseen world of venture capital, private equity, and angel investments. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Kendrick. Kendrick is actually joining us all the way from the US in the West Coast. He's an entrepreneur, an investor, and an advisor. So, Kendrick, if you'd like to introduce yourself to our viewers, that'd be amazing.
Of course. Then thank you for having me on the podcast. So my name is Kendrick Geluz Kho. As you mentioned, I am in San Francisco right now, so we're recording this at 12:36 a.m. my time, but that's all right. I'm a night owl. And so I have been in the VC industry as an investor for the last 8 years, and that started at a place called Hone Capital, about 300 million under management, for rounding and so on. That was early and late stage and growth stage, just a little bit of everything. Then I moved to a 3 billion under management firm called Global Founders Capital, which is headed by the, I guess, infamous Oliver Samwer of Rocket Internet fame. And then now I have my own venture capital firm. I'm co-founder and general partner of Sierra Madre, and we focus on this thesis that revolves around the idea that there is infinite demand and finite supply in the world, and that's the core tension for a lot of things. Many entrepreneurs and investors, they think you can sort of tackle just the demand side, and with the definition of infinite, it's sort of a fool's errand or a folly to think you can. It's of course important, but you're not going to get all the way there. So we really focus on the supply side and technologies that impact that supply side, whether that's more productivity, step function changes in capabilities, or unlocking new markets. And then before this whole VC career, I was in data science, I was an entrepreneur, and oddly enough, I was in civil engineering as my original technical expertise out of undergraduate. So that's a little bit about me.
That's awesome. And I think you mentioned just now, obviously, you came from a data science background and then into venture capital. I mean, that's not a transition that you see quite a lot of people kind of make. How did that kind of happen for you? What was that kind of stepping point that made you kind of step into venture capital? And was it really like a smooth transition, or was it like kind of hiccups along the road that you learned your way through venture capital?
Right. For me, the desire to enter venture capital was there since 2014, which was uh, the conclusion and the first year out of my undergraduate career. And it really sparked out of this idea that I had realized, this epiphany, that the problem with distribution of energy technologies is not actually technical, it's economic, right? Like we've been generating electricity for like 100 years. Even solar panels have been commercially available since the 1980s. But the reason why a lot of countries or communities don't have electrification or renewable energy or what have you, it's economic. They can't afford it. And that's what led me to this arc around how do we spur business, how do we encourage private sector development, and how do we encourage uh, economic growth in general, right? So this long idea of being in venture capital was always there. Well, not always, but after my undergraduate career. And then the mechanisms of how to get there. That was the discovery of it, right? So I had this data science background and I started pitching VCs. Look, it's the 21st century. There must be something we can do with data, AI, ML to change the investment process. And this was 2016, right? So some experiments, but not any, very few brand names really delving into it. Even today, it's still a relatively underexplored idea, right? Um, so I found my way into Hone Capital, and that was the mandate: was how do we use how does Kendrick create some things that are of utility out of the data science, machine learning, or AI world for our investment practice. And I did that, but it just so happens most VC firms are like startups, right? You have to wear multiple hats, and once you've got the tech guy in here, why don't you use the tech guy for other things like this software company, right? There's a SaaS company, open source, whatever. Can you help us out here? Like, what do you think? And that was really the transition by chance of AI, ML, data science, data scientist into traditional investor, even if I am armed with some of that technical knowledge.
That's awesome. And do you think, because obviously, investors come from all kind of different backgrounds, right? Obviously, your background coming from data science, do you think that kind of background that you have and that technical knowledge that you have kind of influences your investment decisions sometimes? Do you think it kind of maybe changes your perspective on some companies that you might want to invest in or you might not want to invest in, given on your experience in the past?
I think so. And I think it influences my decision making and my strategy in a couple of ways. One is that, of course, it informs how I think about things, right? If it's a, I invested in a company called Great Expectations, as an example. It's this data validity, verification software, open source software initially, and then now they're trying to build a full SaaS solution around it. And having a data science background, it helped me evaluate that. There are other companies that have nothing to do with data from a core value proposition standpoint, but the approach I take is what or how might they use data science or artificial intelligence or machine learning to enhance that value proposition, right? And that's oftentimes the brainstorming I do with those entrepreneurs. And then finally, there's a third category of how it informs my decision making or my investment strategy, and that is the overall portfolio construction. I even have this. I wrote this piece up called, I think, diversification and venture portfolio construction, something like that, and it gained a little bit of notoriety. Some famous GPs reposted it. It's got a like on Twitter by Mark Andreessen, and the idea is if, and this is a still controversial and very counter to the traditional VC approach, but if the median venture fund is here, right, and the mean is up here in returns, um, you might as well just approximate the mean, and you would do that by just making a lot more investments, right? Because when you take a lot of investments or a lot of anything, you tend towards that average, given that the average is so much higher than the most frequent outcome. It just says that most people would actually do better if you just invest in more companies. So that's one way that a data approach has changed how I view investing, the overall practice of investments. There are other things, various heuristics that I've discovered are validated by data over time, like the number of founders and sort of like how big these rounds are and timings and so on that I've learned over time after having scraped the data and actually created models around it. But those are little tidbits. Those are um, they're not core big fundamental shifts in how I view the world.
No, that's awesome. And I know actually quite a big chunk of our listeners are, in a data science background themselves, working as data scientists or, that some of them are actually in university, studying essentially to become data scientists. So if there's anyone that wants to essentially make that transition, similar to what you did, right? They're working in data science and they want to step into the venture capital world or, the investment world with their technical skills. Is there any advice that you give to someone that wants to make that kind of leap and I guess kind of a little bit of a shift in their career?
Well, one, I would say definitely reach out to me, and I'm happy to brainstorm with each individual person. Other than that, the advice I would give is to treat it as a small data problem often, right? Like one time I was once upon a time I was working at Amazon, right? And one of my jobs or privileges was to see the health and the aggregate health dashboard of a family of consumer devices like the Kindle, the Fire Phone, the Alexa, right? And you're talking about literally millions of devices. You can aggregate it and cut it up in different ways, and we had to figure out what to measure and so on. And at least at the early stage, but even at later stages, the for venture capital or startups, the data is far more constrained, far more sparse, and you have to be far more creative about it because there is a very thin playbook here to deal with, right? If you've got two gentlemen and a dog in a garage, and that's the startup that you're trying to glean some insight from using data science, you've got to be really creative and you've got to find data that's really just for that situation, right? Or how might we quantify product market fit, but for this company, that's going to look dramatically different than for this company, right? So it's something, it's a transition or an adaptation of a data science career that requires a bit of creativity, I would say.
No, that's awesome. I think a lot of people might potentially actually hit you up to
Yeah,
kind of
sure.
find out. But I mean, it's an interesting aspect. It's an industry that a lot of people could potentially want to explore and see essentially how that element can come about. But can't you kind of taking a bit of a leap, I guess, a little bit further backwards from currently, into your entrepreneurial journey? What I'm kind of keen to understand, is around the companies that you essentially, potentially working with, and the companies that you've started up, and how that kind of came to be. Obviously, you had both sides of the investor perspective, the entrepreneur perspective, and how does that kind of work in unison for you right now?
For me, I try to, and feel free to correct me or ask another question if I'm interpreting it incorrectly. But for me, I view it as helpful from an empathy standpoint to know the entrepreneurial struggle, to think about the world in a very similar way, as far as I have to reach product market fit, but I also have to balance the reality of, mortgage, health insurance, payroll, whatever else, plus navigating investors and sometimes getting your butt kicked by hearing a lot of no's. Interestingly, my position as a VC right now, having in the process of working on my own firm, it in itself is an entrepreneurial journey, and I've already had to hear a lot of no's from the people I asked for money from. Right, so there's this uh, two sides. Like I didn't have this facet as a tradition as a VC in another institution, but now it's my own institution, right? And you get all sorts of questions, you get all sorts of requests for proof points, interviews, references, and so on. And it does remind me of my time as an entrepreneur, and it reminds me even today to understand that entrepreneurial struggle that the founders go through, right? Um, I don't know if I interpreted the question correctly, but hopefully that just
Yeah,
gives
no,
some insight.
yeah, no, 100%. I mean, it's really cool to understand, that kind of perspective, because sometimes, you see investors taking a bit more of a, I guess, quote unquote, traditional route, if you will, straight from university into, private equity or venture capital. So sometimes that lack of, understanding, being that entrepreneur in that kind of stage, and knowing essentially the kind of struggles that you went through as an entrepreneur or going through simultaneously in that kind of respect. So, Kendrick, obviously, keeping that in the back of your mind, when you're looking at startups now, what key indicators do you look for to determine, in terms of your kind of criteria, when a startup is investable in your eyes? What key elements do you look for? Or what key things do you want to see from the founders or the startup itself?
Right. And I should caveat this by saying it may not be investable for my firm or myself as an angel investor at that particular time, but it could very well have many other potential investors that it's a high degree of fit for. And then there's a number of other factors. But so I will just use the criteria that I use, right? And that we use at Sierra Madre. One is this idea of founder problem fit. And a lot of people think founder market fit, right? Does this founder have a lot of background in this particular space that they're building? I view it, or I interpret this product founder problem fit a little differently. And that is to say, at every stage of a startup's journey, there is some kind of critical need, right? For a foundational AI company, it's going to be highly technical. You're going to want or be looking for some world class research backgrounds, right? Other types of businesses might be like a CPG startup, right? Or like a consumer, direct to consumer startup. You're going to want to see somebody with a lot of marketing, sales background, right? And if that's the critical need of the business, you could have two Stanford, Harvard PhDs who went to work at Google as software engineers, and they could be working on a pet food company, right? And the triggers for most VCs are there like, wow, they have the pedigree, they've got the work experience, they're technical, but that doesn't match the core needs of that company, right? Or the core requirements that will be the make or break for that startup. And I look for that degree of fit. Another thing I look for is, having just spent the last 30 seconds talk about not founder market fit, there is this degree of what is the depth of thinking and evaluation that a set of founders have done on their market. And they don't have to come from that market, right? But to understand competitive dynamic, right? To understand what kind of buyer persona there is, to even be able to back into the numbers of, let's just say, $100 million business, right? $100 million revenue business. If you can back into the bottoms up math into that, what are the levers? How sophisticated is that thinking, right? These all show that a founder or founders have really evaluated, made their way through the market, and they have a prepared mind, so to say, right? And so those are some of the things that I and we at Sierra Madre use as the proof points or the evaluation points for something that's a pre-seed or a seed stage startup.
No, that's awesome. And obviously, you're not only an investor, right? You're also an advisor to these startups. So you're helping kind of guide them along their journey. But I'm guessing you also see quite a lot of first time founders, throughout your career that potentially, you always makes mistakes, right? You never learn unless you make a mistake. But I'm guessing you kind of see some general mistakes that first time founders make. What are the most common mistakes that you see founders make that you try to obviously maybe advise them to avoid or help them kind of navigate, the labyrinth of founding your own company?
Right. I think one of the key mistakes, at least if you're building a tech startup and going out to VCs, is not speaking or using the right language, right? And that's it's an unfortunate reality. It should be more merit based, right? But it just goes to show, do these founders know how to look the part? Do they know how to the right mentality with which a tech startup that is venture backed should have with regards to growth, capital efficiency, right? All of these things. Are they aware? Are they clued in, right? And I think that's one mistake is they don't accurately or they don't preemptively dress themselves the right way, right? To the best of their ability. And that's really optimizing for fundraising, sales, recruiting, right? Like not really the heart of building and execution, but I think that is a critical mistake. I think another one is um, I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase it, but there's this mismatch of pace, and this is not a one size fits all, but a lot of the notable learning points that I've had over the venture capital investing career have been you invest in these really experienced VPs of engineering, product, so on, from high caliber tech companies, just as an example. And they do not move at the same pace that you would expect a startup to be at, right? They don't deliver, they don't iterate, they believe that the user wants this one package, right? And they build this one package and then they release it and they release it on their own time and then they don't really get feedback until that thing is out there. Um, it's the idea of this like waterfall deployment versus something that's a little bit more iterative where you create an MVP, you build on top of it. And it is a pitfall that a lot of experienced professionals who become founders fall into. So I think that's one major lesson of really you should over index on getting something out in customers' hands, learnings from that, and so on. And then maybe the final thing, because threes are very nice, but the final quick lesson for me is that you want uh, the lesson is that I think people should have a better idea of what their eventual economics, unit economics, gross margin, so on and so forth, would and should be or could be down the road. Because I think a lot of entrepreneurs go down one path, assuming that you can improve without really understanding where the economic levers are in their business, such that, we just want to get something out there. We want to get some sales. We want to feel some kind of dopamine feedback from doing this thing, but it might be a misguided effort, right? There are a number of businesses that have negative margins, and there's been no way to crawl out of that pit because there was no investment up front of time, of energy, of effort to figure out, is this product configuration really the right product configuration? Can it actually lead to a business rather than sort of a money pit? I don't want to criticize it too much, but just to say that what is that line of sight and how do we get there to a healthy business behind the startup?
I think it's very interesting. I think it's always kind of like a learning trajectory, right? It can be at different points as well during the startup's growth and the startup's phases. Obviously, when it comes to investments, you can always be like a full life cycle investor. You could be an early stage investor. You could be a late stage investor. For you, where does that kind of sweet spot sit? Where do you really want to, or where do you usually actually insert yourself into a startup? Is it really in the early stage, mid stage, late stage? Where's the kind of element for you guys?
For us at Sierra Madre, and then for myself as an investor, for Sierra Madre, really early to growth stage, and it's a matter of experience, like what we have experience in, a matter of practicality, which is we aren't a $1 trillion institution or 100 or even a single $1 billion institution, so it's harder to participate in the larger later companies. But even as a person, when I was at a place like Global Founders Capital, or when I had a more flexible remit backed by the capital at another institution, I prefer to be at the early stages. And to some people, to an asset manager at Bridgewater, early stage is like a Series CD. So I know we have to qualify that a bit, but early stage is pre-seed, seed, Series A to me, and that's usually where I like to work. Those are the founders I like to work with the most. One is that uh, there's you feel a little bit more needed. I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it, but there's a little bit more impact, there's a little bit more emotionality in it, right? And I think the other part of that is there is a the practical entrepreneurial business building nature of it is that you as an investor fight with other investors, right? And the more well known a startup is, the more fighting you have to do, which is not a bad thing, but it is easier. We used to say, as an example, that the most insecure a founder will be is when they're raising their first check. So that's like the time, right? That's the time you have a chance. I have a chance. Um, so I don't know. That's just a random anecdote.
No, that's awesome. I mean, obviously, when it comes to the life cycle of a startup, I think there's obviously different stages. Like you mentioned, in the earlier stages, that's where you can have, obviously, as an advisor, some of the most impact into a startup, kind of defining their growth, defining what they'll be. Because in the later stages, there might be, like you mentioned, some pitfalls that are extremely hard to climb out of, and kind of avoiding them in the early stages is pretty much the route I'm guessing most obviously investors try to take. So, Kendrick, I guess I'm curious. When do you find an investable candidate? Essentially a startup that you want to invest in, you want to back. What's your due diligence process usually look like? What do you look for? What key flags you make sure are aligned in terms of making sure that you've done your research about a company and it's a 100% investable company for you?
Right. I'm going to, I'm sure other guests have answered it in all their various ways. I'll give one philosophy, then I'll give a couple of pointers underneath. So the philosophy that I have is that there's a this idea of boiling the ocean is glorified often, right? You hear of these like 40-page investment memos, and we've gone through what we believe is everything, right? If for like a pre-seed startup or a seed startup. And I think I'll actually give an anecdote. Again, I have had two situations where you've done people have done all the work, right? And we did all the work. We looked at all these things you can think of, maybe not to the same extent as the 40-page investment memo or hiring Bain, like the consultants to go look at it. But we did a lot of investigative work, right? And then in these two situations, the founders became sick, right, with a major disease. In one case, cancer. In another case, something as severe, right? And so you can boil the ocean and you can't control for certain things, right? And these are the most extreme examples, but you could have COVID, right? And then some business model is completely wiped out. You can have another situation where a major backer pulls out, some technical stack improves, right? Like here was wave one of GANs, which are generative adversarial networks, which were used to create images, and then you have this new architecture, which is just fundamentally better, order of magnitude better. Well, what can you do? Some order of magnitude better technology came out, right? So even if you try boiling the ocean, you're not going to catch everything. So I have this philosophy that you want to do uh, to not boil the ocean effectively, right? You want to look at some key factors. You want to look at plausibility. You want to evaluate headwinds, tailwinds, and then the dynamism of that team, right? To navigate these routes. Um, Okay, so that's philosophy on diligence overall. Now, some specific pointers to me, I actually care a lot more about market than the traditional early stage investor. And the way I phrase it is market defines the outcome set, right? This selection of market and so on and how it turns out means you can support, or there could feasibly be $100 billion startup in that category. There could be a 10, there could be a 1, there could just be maybe the biggest thing that could show up in that category is 100 million, right? And then everything else determines the position on that outcome set. So, when investors don't pay any attention or completely discount a market, I get a little, I just choose to operate in a different way, right? So that's one. Um, Philosophy number two is, and I alluded to this previously, I'd like to see the math to support a venture style outcome. You can try to convince me that the market will grow. You can try to convince me that, X percent or Y percent of these buyers will convert, or these are the benchmarks, but they have to be plausible to me, right? So can it be $100 million revenue business with the implication that there's a 10x revenue multiple later? Can you support an 80% margin or a 70% gross margin, or is the math too fantastic for me to be feasible? And even going through that exercise, I think, is one, helpful for the founders, but two, something that a lot of founders and a lot of VCs don't have that much experience in. So
Yeah.
hopefully that's a good, from top to bottom, coverage of the diligence that I do.
I think it's really interesting. I think every investor has its own have their own unique way of vetting and making sure that the startups they invest in are suitable candidates, right? Because you can have a really interesting idea, but then you want to see everything that goes on behind the scenes to make sure it is going to be an investment that could potentially have return on, and kind of going from that point. And Kendrick, obviously touching on the area that you're most involved in, data and AI. I think it's a super, interesting topic right now, especially in the last few weeks as well. But I think there's so much going on, in the realm of AI, in the realm of data. Um, I guess something I'm pretty curious about is, what is really exciting you right now in the market? What maybe company that you're maybe involved with, or not necessarily involved with, that you know about, is really kind of exciting in terms of technologies or in terms of what they're doing in the market. Is there any kind of examples that you can share with us?
Um, Maybe I'll answer it from like the tech side of things and then working the way
Yeah,
to
100%.
maybe a specific example. I know that the flavor of the year is this generative AI wave, and we're seeing shades of 2017, 2018 when all the rage was AI, but for self-driving cars and deep learning. So, and Nvidia was at that point at an all-time high, if I recall, and so now we're at history repeats itself. Um, so I can't pull out the crystal ball here, but I do think that there's going to be some exciting developments, both in application and in the infrastructure to support generative AI and predictive AI. And that's probably a prediction that nobody is surprised by, of course, right? I do think that if I were to make a specific claim about this generative or predictive AI space, I think that there will be a coming boom in the ease of use for creating and defining new, not just generative bots, right, like the ChatGPT playground, but an added layer of sophistication. We'll call it some no code stuff, some low code stuff of how to define and deploy whether these are agents that are autonomously doing actions. I call it RPA 2.0, or their particular uh, things like chat interface. But I think that there's going to be a boom here because I believe that is the opportunity. There is this vast business process outsourcing industry, which are humans today in all of these emerging markets. And I feel like there's this upskilling that can happen and a whole tool stack layer that can support that, right? Um, One example is a company I invested in. So there's my hook to the company. It's called Wordware, and it's this it's the ability to, in a no code low code esque way, define particular steps that you would want, let's just say ChatGPT to work on, and then the input flows into another step and then another step, and it might be able to ingest other information from outside, and you could then create something that writes a book for you, right? Because writing a book is not going to ChatGPT and saying write me a book. It is define an outline, how many chapters, 15 chapters, what genre, all of these things. And then once you've got the outline, you pick from the outline, you iterate on the outline, and then you say, this outline, I want you to expand into these chapters in this way, right? And so it's a multi-step process. Yeah, and so there's, how do you define this bigger workflow, right? And that's really that potential, I think, is this workflow-esque. How do we create it and define it? Simultaneously, I have a lot of faith and belief that agentic AI will continue to take off and hopefully create a new wave of productivity gains. I also think that there is, within the next 5 to 10 years, uh, the idea that one day AI has to link back to the real world. So robotic controls, predictive iteration, simulative iteration, what have you, into electrical engineering design, civil engineering design, mechanical engineering design, energy stuff. And so there's this whole like industrial manufacturing and productive sector that I think is still under revolutionized for the sake of making the industrial revolution pun. And so there's efforts today, but I think that it's still very much in the first like 10 minutes of the soccer match, right? We're not getting to overtime, extra time yet.
I think it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the market right now that you're seeing this the slow, gradual kind of increase in utilization, within AI. And I think there's a lot of companies, you see almost every single company now kind of branding themselves, we're an AI company, right? Some obviously, they have a quite good utilization. Some obviously try to jump, I guess, a little bit on the hype of AI. I guess in terms of yourself, what key criteria do you really look for or I guess flags from a company to really be like, okay, this is really an AI company. It's not just a company that maybe utilizes AI in some bit of their product or, in some element and try to brand themselves as an AI company. How do you make that distinction?
There's two remarks I'll say. One is that I have, if you come here to the Bay Area and you land in Oakland International, as you drive out, there's a billboard on the side of a hangar, and it's like, I think it's for dial pad, but it's like AI dialer, AI this, AI that, and it has this checklist where they just put AI in front of each one of their features, and I kind of laugh at that, but I think it is indicative where to the extent that customers, whether those are end consumers or professionals or the executives at companies, they're looking for something that says AI, right? And you almost have a business almost has a moral obligation to market themselves in such a way that resonates the best with their customers. So if the way you do that is by calling yourself an AI company and putting on AI features, then like so be it. And if I as an investor benefit from that because this business takes off via competitors, I am very supportive of that. Um, so that's comment one. Comment two is that there are a number of companies, and this is part of my advisory work, consulting work, but there are a number of companies that use AI, right, in the service of another value proposition. So if we take Slope as an example, it's this whole layer around B2B payments, right? And then they've also do some buy now, pay later, but for B2B as well. And they are using artificial intelligence. In this case, they created something called Slope GPT, I think, and then they augmented that with other AI driven functionality. And all of this is to better evaluate transactions, better classify transactions, easier, more reliably, cheaper than a rules based system could. And as a quick illustration, this is not really getting into the heart of what they do, but as a quick illustration, you might have a description of a transaction, right? And you could ask GPT, especially a particular configuration of this, like, LLM, is this closer to risky or farther away from risky? Are these terms and these words more closely associated with fraud, or are they farther than fraud, right? Um, so trivial example, but just a use of how AI might support a value proposition. But to get to the heart of your question, for me, an AI company is something a company that really is doing some what's the right way to phrase it, but it is a company that is their sole product is the artificial intelligence, right? Or it has some AI at its core. And that's not really a satisfactory answer to me, but I think it illustrates how difficult it is to separate, right? Like, oh, you marketed it as AI, or you're using AI for some portion of it, or you're using AI, but somebody else's AI for what you're really building, and you created the wrapper around it. So it's a very challenging thing to really define and nail down.
I think it's really interesting. I've seen quite a lot of companies now in the market that have this really cool like product or service offering. But when you kind of dig down into it, you see it's basically linked to a bunch of other services, and they kind of gift wrapped a little service that combines it and made into a product. So obviously, those kind of companies, I think they have obviously a great market fit and some potential. But it's quite interesting to see, how investors' perspectives when it comes to these kind of AI companies look at. And I guess, Kendrick, in terms of the companies that you invest in, obviously there's going to be some nuances when it comes to like, geographic focus, maybe currently or maybe in the past. Where's been predominantly your kind of focus? Obviously, I'm guessing, you're based in the US. So I'm guessing there's been quite a lot of focus in the US, but has there been any other kind of geographic areas that you touched on, or is it mainly the US? How do you really kind of see that market right now?
For me, it has been a little bit more global than a lot of my contemporaries here in Silicon Valley. That's because I grew up in Southeast Asia. I worked in Southeast Asia. I worked in West Africa. And then the last firm I was with, Global Founders Capital, is one of the most active investors in Europe. We're headquartered in Berlin, by the way. So that really led me to this global perspective. Um, of course, I still focus in the United States, specifically here in the Bay Area or Silicon Valley, but not exclusively. Just I just happen to be here. But it has led me to be a bit more open-minded, and it has led to this added layer of seeing geography as particularly relevant in the diligence, right? And in what you build. So there's this idea, the rocket internet has been done this very well, but the idea of geographic arbitrage, right? And that's still as relevant today as it was before. Now, there are facets and adjustments that we have to make without blindly saying you can take one business model and one product from the United States or from China or wherever and apply it elsewhere wholesale, right? Um, but for me at Sierra Madre, we're open to innovation all around the world, right? We invest heavily in the United States, of course. We support the industrial sort of, we call it industrial evolution, but we support that largely in the United States, but are open to it elsewhere. Sometimes it just so happens that the density of founders who build in the spaces we're really interested in, it just more frequently happens in the United States um, for us. Uh, if I was to create a commentary on the market, though, I would say that there has been generally, my observation, right, just a single person's observation, there's generally been a tightening of interest from uh, venture investors, right? Like Founders Fund, Ribbit Capital, so on. They would have gone further afield to find startups that they really wanted to invest in, right? They might have gone to Southeast Asia. So Founders Fund, as an example, has gone to the Philippines. Um, I think that was a facet of the 2015 or 16 all the way to 2021. And I think that these firms are returning to their core focus. So I think if we were to give actionable advice, go look for your local VCs.
That's really interesting. And in terms of kind of different regions, obviously, you've had quite a wide scope in terms of a global focus, if you will. Is there any kind of emerging trends that you see? Any kind of regions that might have been a lot quieter in terms of like startups and that kind of boom, essentially, of entrepreneurs that you've seen kind of change over the last couple of years?
Uh, that's a good question, and I think that there have been booms. I'm not the best person to speak to them, but there have been booms in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, likely in other geographies, some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, as an example. I can't really give you a good expert opinion on how those ecosystems will do today to the next 5 years. I do think that there's this one facet that makes it a little challenging, or that investors have to go into things eyes wide open, I should say. There is this question of what is the outcome that as an investor you're looking for, right? I need a $1 billion startup to make my money back compellingly, or I need a $10 billion startup, right? Because a lot of venture firms here in Silicon Valley, they actually need a $10 billion outcome, right? Or $100 billion outcome, or 10, $10 billion outcomes, right? Um, and there are a lot of geographies in the world that have funds that require big outcomes, but don't actually have the capital markets, the exits, the revenue potential to support it. So at least in those certain categories that you might invest in, right? So that is a thing that I think will bite more investors in the back, right? Coming up, because I mean, I have friends in Southeast Asia, right? And I know some of the GPs and big firms there. And if you do this math, it, it's uh, it's scary that there might not be enough value creation that exits to support them being considered a success. And so, what do? I don't know, but that's something that emerging markets investors will have to navigate.
That's really interesting. And do you think that there are like any kind of challenges or potentially benefits as well, as opposed to being like a local investor, like you mentioned, for example, let's say somebody purely investing in the United States market, or there's somebody that kind of branches out and goes out. Obviously, I'm guessing there'll be challenges that come, branching out and investing in startups abroad, but there could potentially also be benefits or also drawbacks that kind of come with it. Is there any ones that you think are like really big ones that people have to overcome sometimes when investing abroad, or when focusing on the local market?
Yeah, a couple of them, and one is that lack of familiarity about a market. And a classic example here is uh, Silicon Valley or London or Berlin, those kinds of investors then parachuting. Uh, it's sort of a derogatory term, but you get it. I mean, like they somehow end up, and no matter how much work they do, they can actually work to become well aware of that market, but many of them don't or have this impression that that market is a smaller, less developed version of the United States. China does this as well. You'll see a lot of Chinese firms that have popped up around the world, right? Chinese backed firms, Japanese backed firms, Korean backed firms. They somehow pop up in regions that are not their core region. And they think that the world operates like them, but minus 10, 20, 30 years. The problem with, let's just say, Southeast Asia is that uh, behaviors are different, right? the the appetite for software for like B2B software is not there, especially to pay a monthly fee, right? Like a SaaS fee. That's something that is not in the consumer behavior, that customer behavior of a business. And so thinking that, oh, this is just the US but smaller and earlier, like that mentality doesn't get you very far, right? It leads you down the wrong path. Um, Ditto, that same thinking for unit economics, right? As another example, pulling from Southeast Asia, there are countries where what would have been a decent margin business in the United States is a near zero or negative margin business in that country because of regulatory capture, because of economic inertia, because of all these things, right? So to say, oh, I know this playbook and I know this diligence book, I know this business model, so it must work over there. That's a bit of folly. And then, of course, there's all the other treachery of saying, you're not a local, you don't know that this person's like this or this institution's doesn't behave very well, what have you. That being said, there can be some benefits. Um, there is a halo effect often if you're coming from London, right, or from New York, and you show up in Nairobi or in Singapore, right? And so it can work both ways, but I tend to think that it has a lot of traps, a lot of potential pitfalls.
No, definitely. I think we see that both on the investor side, right, and also on a company side, right, on the founder and entrepreneur side, right, because you see a lot of companies that are monsters in their own market, right. They're dominating their own field. For example, let's say in the US or in the UK or in Germany, for example. But then when they try to step with the same business model into another region, they miserably fail. Like some of these are massive companies that might generate over 100 million in revenue, and they obviously they dominate their own market, but when they try to take the exact same business model into a different region, that's when things become a little bit shaky, because obviously each region and each kind of area in the world will operate slightly differently, and these companies need to obviously make the adjustments alike. So I think it's a really interesting element. And Kenji, kind of going back to AI and machine learning, I think one really interesting thing that we spoke about previously prior to this is stuff that you've personally built, utilizing AI and machine learning to aid essentially in the venture capital world. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I think that's a really interesting element.
Yes, of course. A lot of what I'll talk to you about is from Hone Capital, and Hone Capital's defunct, so you're not going to find too much on the internet about them. But a lot of what I built, and this reflects this philosophical question, right? Do you replace the investor or do you support the investor? Do you replace human capital or do you augment it, right? And our philosophy at Hone was really to capture the investment process and enhance it in ways that a person is not equipped to do. So, not replacing the human. And that philosophy was born out of a couple of motivations. One, I like having a job, but um, on top of that, the idea that this is an art, especially early stage investing, but even late stage investing, right? It's an art, not necessarily a science. So it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to wrap every factor into a model. And that's why this idea of how do we augment the decision maker or how do we augment the analyst was the approach I took. So one example was this model that one of my team members made, which evaluated growth rate of a startup and tried to match it against a series of benchmarks that included other unicorns, right? And to say, uh, is this growing, like a unicorn? Is it not? Or where is it slipping? Or what's going on here, right? And that's something that would be a far more difficult problem for a human, especially to match against 100 unicorns, right? Of the pass on a series of metrics. Where the human comes in is to say, wait, you made this machine made that comparison. Are these two companies even relevant? Like you grew like Uber, but your B2B enterprise sales, like that doesn't make sense or that doesn't match or there's something where this is not so relevant, right? That's one example. There's another example that used a model that I created that used a series of factors, about 20 factors of a potential 500 that we evaluated. And using these 20 factors, it said, this is the percent probability using a random forest classifier. And we had to iterate to figure out that this was the model that really made the most sense. But using a random forest classifier, is this startup likely to raise a Series A given it raises the seed or not? Right. And the corollary from there was we then built a model that was it raises this Series A, what's the probability it will get to Series B? So there are a number of models, and that was used as an assist for the human. Right? The human would say, "Oh, my confidence is of them getting to Series A or C to Series A is this. What is the machine's confidence? Oh, that's interesting. Why is there a difference? What are the factors that make it so?" If we were to take if you'll indulge me, just one little expansion of this anecdote, there was one analysis that I did that looked at who the seed investors were in a startup, right? And how is this predictive of the probability that this company raising the seed would get to Series A? And this set of sort of the analysis and the model determined that it was not the first most successful investor on a cap table that mattered the most, nor the second, but the third most successful. And by successful, I'm talking about the seed to A graduation rate. So if you had one firm that was an investor that had really great conversion rate, and then the next two investors were nobodies versus a startup where there was three investors on that cap table that were all above average but not exceptional, that second case was more likely to raise that Series A. And so, why is that, right? You ask some questions, and my hypothesis is it's because this is a community, right? It takes a village, and not only does it take a village, but you want different skill sets, perspectives, support structures, and maybe some of that commentary about contrarian analysis is needs to be caveated, right? Because like one sort of outlier versus like a tribe that does believe in you and they all see the vision, right? So there's some extra commentary to be had there, but I'll digress because that's far more commentary than we have time for.
No, that's awesome. I think there's quite obviously different utilizations and different elements that this can come in, really handy, really interesting, having that perspective of a different kind of stat essentially to compare your thoughts to or your kind of understanding of the startup of whether it's going to get to a Series A or a Series B. I think that's a really interesting kind of comparison to make. But I mean, Kendrick, in terms of yourself, obviously, like we mentioned earlier, I think we touched on it a little bit. Obviously, you invest in a startup, but you don't just kind of invest and step back. You're also an advisor to these companies. So, in terms of the startups you invest in the past or startups you're currently involved with, how much involvement do you typically like to have with these companies? Do you like to be really hands-on, essentially, with the founders, or is it more kind of like an advisory kind of piece that you tend to typically take? or are there any kind of examples that you can share with us?
Of course. And I should say that there are startups that I am an investor in, and they're off to the races and they don't need me. There are other organizations that I consult or advise for, and that's a professional relationship that I don't have any investment in. So we have to accommodate the whole landscape. But as an investor, I don't like to force the issue, right? Like not every startup wants provide at all times, right? Some are perfectly fine and they just wanted the money and a friendly shoulder, and I can provide that. There are others that want a lot of advice and want product direction or want brainstorming on KPIs to go and vision and so on. Happy to be there. There's some others that want some data science input, and I'm there as well. So it really depends. And there are yet another set of founders where the the most desired value add that they want from an investor is silence. So they don't want they don't want their investors to come to them at all, right? So that's I accommodate this whole spectrum, and I usually describe it to founders as a pull function. So you need me, or if you send me an update, okay, I'll see it. If you know that I can provide something in particular, go ahead and ping me. Otherwise, I have faith in you. That's why, we invested in you because you're the expert and we are the supporting cast. Um, those some examples, and just this is more illustrative of an overall relationship. But there are some founders that I have been privileged enough to attend, to be invited and attend their weddings, right? There are other founders where they've called me into a room over time, multiple times, right? And they'll tell me, Kendrick, we have problems with our other investors. Like, how do we navigate this? Right? Can you sit down with us? What should we actually say? Can you proofread this email? There are other founders who have said we are going through a founder breakup. Can you help? Can you represent us? Or like, how do we clean up this presence on our cap table? What other things do we do? Can you read through these contracts? And so the gamut really is it's broad. Um, one more occasion, there was this company. Uh, this is a trivial example, but they asked for a number of data science projects, straight on projects, and I was able to provide that to complete those projects for them. Things like evaluation of like what is the data science model that you would create to optimize revenue mix. Right, I said I can kind of pseudocode it and then put it on a Python script, and you probably want to upgrade this in the future and so on. But here's like the start of it, and this is the future direction that I would do. Right. So those are a smattering of examples without diving too much into the details or exposing the names of any single one.
No, that's really interesting. Obviously, that you have kind of from A to Z kind of approach. Some founders, you fully essentially ride with them throughout the whole process. Some essentially, maybe it's not their first rodeo, I'm guessing, and they essentially they know maybe a bit more about what they're doing, and they just need an investor on board to kind of have that trajectory. But look, Kendrick, I guess something I'm really curious about, and I love to ask this question to a lot of people. In terms of your career so far, right, from beginning at the in a data space to obviously now in the venture capital space, what would you say is the biggest lesson that you've learned throughout your career that maybe shaped the way you think about your approach to investments or your approach to general companies that you work with, maybe from the entrepreneurial side or the venture capital side or the data side, anything across the board? What would you say is like the biggest lesson that impacted you?
Oh, that's a difficult question, especially to classify it as the biggest lesson. I'm trying to think, and I
Or we
feel
could
like
say
I've
a big lesson.
right, and I think I've dropped bits and pieces along the way, right? Evaluation of
Yeah.
market, not boiling the ocean, investing in more companies rather than fewer companies because the math supports it. Um, I think for me, this is a big lesson for my investing, but also my personal life and evaluating people and so on. But uh, I invested in this company called Deal. Alex and Shore are friends of mine. I've known Alex for since 2013, I think. And they have something called deal speed, and it's this. He goes into it more when he was talking to somebody, but this idea that to build something important and meaningful, it has to be your passion, right? It has to be I don't want to say all consuming, but very consuming, right? So he Alex as a CEO is maybe the easiest example for me to draw because he's on WhatsApp 24/7, open to his customers. You know, a customer can ping him, or an investor or a friend like myself can ping him, and he will respond in like 5, 3, 1 minute, and it could be something trivial, and he's just always clued in because he wants to build something big and important, right? And I think that's really an indicative lesson for me.
That's amazing. And I think off the back of that, I think there's also like caveat. Obviously, there's lessons that you learn throughout your career and stuff that kind of helps you shape your way of thought. But there's also people that I guess that impact you along your journey. If you were to kind of pinpoint, a piece of advice or a piece of well, I guess yeah, advice would be the best way to categorize a piece of advice that somebody gave you at any point of your career that made you think, what, I want to, take this with me and I'm going to implement it in my day to day or essentially my career. What would that advice be, and how would you kind of relate it to people, starting their career now and kind of, wanting to partake in
Right, I'll cheat. I'll give two, and
it?
one is commentary on advice, and uh, I get a kick because sometimes I hear. I've been fortunate to have 8 years in the venture capital industry now, right? And some of those companies I invested in the past have now done well, and that founder is now rich or exited or whatever. And sometimes you see these people, whether in a podcast or in the news or on a guest lecture, and you hear their story, right? And they might give some advice, and quite often it's post hoc, right? At the time in the trenches, it was a mess, right? There's like stuff flying
Yeah,
everywhere and so on. And then when they tell the story, quite often it is the narrative is cleaned up, right? Like I knew it all along. We were going to succeed because of this, and I'm not going to say everyone has that, but it's somewhat of a human bias and human tendency to try to instill order where there's chaos, right? And to make the story make sense. And so a lot of the advice is one, take it with a grain of salt. And two, what I've noticed is that you've seen it before, right? There are people who say that they're billionaires and they sleep 4 hours a day. There are others who sleep eight
yeah,
hours or 10 hours a day. They wake up at 4 a.m. or they wake up at 9 a.m. And so I say treat advice as something in the toolbox, not as gospel. You don't just like, if I do this, I'm going to be like that guy.
yeah, of
Like
course.
you pull this wrench out and you try it and maybe it works for you or not. And that's not a problem if you can't wake up at 4 a.m. and it doesn't work for you, right? So that's a one. But two, here's my other piece of advice. Um, but this is not relevant to like investing or entrepreneurship. Maybe it is, but this idea that like people are irrational, right? Like, oh, why did that person do that? That's so irrational. That makes no sense. And I've learned, and the advice that I got, the lesson I learned was that everyone's actually rational. You just haven't figured out their utility function or their framework, right? Like, why does that individual who's, let's just say, a woman from France with no relation to ISIS join ISIS, right? And like that makes no sense. It doesn't seem rational. That seems crazy. And yet there is probably, I would assume, there's some utility function underpinning that makes it rational within that lens, right? Like there's no hero's journey, there's no self-actualization, no sense of belonging, there's no cause that person was able to attach themselves to, therefore they attach themselves to ISIS, right? That could be a rationalization, and it could fit this pattern that you might otherwise think is crazy. And so that's a tool that I have brought to negotiations. That's a tool I've brought to interpersonal relationships. It's a tool that I've found helped me make sense of the world. But I think if we were to keep it most actionable, it's that like negotiation, business, partnership kind of thing where like you might think that the tug of war is around a dollar amount of money, just as an example. But maybe the tug of war is I want to spend more time with the kids. I want to have this family, right? I want to be able to work from home. And that's how, you know, everyone really does act rationally. You just have to figure out what that what that inside of them looks like.
That's really interesting. I've not. It's the first time I actually heard an analogy. And I said, "What do you think about it?" In retrospect, it actually makes a lot of sense. Kind of putting yourself into understanding, why other people think the way they think, and I guess the rationality behind those kind of four elements. And I guess that just kind of bouncing off that very last point that you just mentioned, that kind of tug of war element. In terms of yourself, I think you mentioned, do you want to spend more time with your family? Do you want to do this and do you want to do that element? In terms of your kind of career, right now, obviously venture capital and essentially running your own gig can be seen as extremely time consuming quite a lot of the time. What do you really like to kind of implement into, I guess, your life and into your day to day to make sure you have that kind of balance between work and life and have making sure it's kind of a healthy element for you going forward?
Right. It's a cliche, but I really try to find enjoyment in the things that I do. Cliche, right? But
Yeah, 100%.
to find it intellectually stimulating, to evaluate companies and talk to entrepreneurs that are intellectually stimulating because I have some kind of affinity for that. So for myself, it could be machine learning, artificial intelligence, it could be deep tech, aerospace, energy. For somebody else, again, I'm not faulting them, right? Like I don't have any place in this conversation, but they could live in a house of D2C entrepreneurs and their focus is guerrilla marketing and they get so much joy, so much dopamine, so much thrill of the chase and so on of getting those people on the wait list or converting them and so on. So I think for me a lot of that work life balance is if you really I should have really like drawn a full picture, right? But the idea that if you are fully committed to your craft, you're like Alex at Deal who says you really have to be all obsessed with this desire to build something big and important. If that's you, the way you balance this is ironically by not balancing it. It's by choosing the things that you actually want to do or care about. That's not a one size fits all, right? There are other people who are far more happier than me enjoying life with x amount of hours 30, 40, 50 at their corporate job, right? And they're doing their thing and they're probably happier than me, but that's the way I am able to manage my own work life balance.
No, I think doing something that you're passionate about, something that, I guess makes your brain tick. That's pretty much everybody's kind of goal. Me personally as well. If something kind of engages me, then I'm enjoying my time. It's kind of ingrained into my day to day life, and kind of go from that point. But look, Kendrick, I think the points that we discussed, and I think the insights that you brought in as well, I think they're super interesting. I really thank you for joining me, on this podcast. Obviously, everybody can find Kendrick's LinkedIn and my LinkedIn down below. And I really thank you for joining us today.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. Cheers.